Will you let me know when people are in the room? So we're ready to go. Then I will start by introducing myself. I'm Shannon Gavin Johnson. I'm the director here at Legacy Museum and Troup County Archives, and we are excited to be here in person, some of us via Zoom or Facebook. But this is the first attempt at, I guess, real programming or live programming, I suppose, in several months. So we're excited about that. We are also really excited about our first evening with the experts. All of the staff here, for lack of a better word, we're nerds, and we like to, our hobbies include our research. So often we have interesting subjects that we are looking into even outside of work hours. And so we thought that this would be a good opportunity to look into what our staff is looking at, researching, thinking about, and what we have kind of become experts in. So we're starting tonight with one of our staff members, our newest staff member actually, Victoria Larcheveaux. She is originally from Columbus, Georgia, but she's recently moved here to LaGrange after graduating from Point University. She has a BA in history and a minor in biblical studies. And while she was there, she started conducting some pretty extensive research on the desegregation of public libraries here in Jim Crow, the South during Jim Crow era. History and specifically the civil rights era are of particular interest to Victoria. So she's excited to learn more and look more into this topic. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Victoria.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Victoria. I'm here to present my research here about the desegregation of public libraries in the South. So this first picture we have here was actually taken in 1961 in Albany, Georgia. Scenes like this actually weren't uncommon at the Carnegie libraries. They were usually public institutions, and Carnegie himself had no kind of race stipulation on who could attend. However, when those laws were left up to the states, they themselves enacted segregation, which is why we have scenes like this. So even though everyone that lived in the community was paying taxes on these buildings, they actually weren't able to go in and enjoy the facilities like they should have been able to. So although the public libraries are supposed to be free and public for all people, Jim Crow laws did not allow that to happen. So to better understand why this happened, we kind of need to take a look back at some of the amendments that kind of led to this. So we have what are called the Reconstruction Amendments. They're the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments to the Constitution. So the 13th was one that was supposed to abolish slavery. The 14th granted people that were born in the United States citizenship. And the 15th gave Black males the right to vote. So of course, these all sound good and well if they were actually being enforced. But of course, the people in higher up government that had the option to actually enforce those did not do that. So we had the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1870, which were also supposed to kind of enforce some of those other amendments to make sure that these newly freed slaves in this country actually were able to have their rights and actually have them be followed and enforced. But of course, when you leave that up to the people that are actually taking out the law, those are not really enforced. There was also the Public Accommodations Act of 1875. Again, this goes back to making sure that those amendments were actually followed and enforced. But of course, that was not happening either. And actually in 1883, the courts declared the Public Accommodations Act unconstitutional. And it said that businesses could actually discriminate so long as those actions were in private. So that actually just gave a straight segue to Jim Crow. And of course we have here, so although there was the Jim Crow laws, there were people that fought back because of course these amendments are in place and they should be law and they should be followed. So we get cases like Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Basically the outcome of that Supreme Court case was that separate but equal was fair. So of course that is just segregation. And once you get into that, nothing was actually equal about the separate facilities. They were actually far less if you get to the Black areas. Of course, the South was hit hardest and Blacks were also denied access to numerous public places. What is often overlooked, I feel, is the time in between the Plessy case in 1896 and the civil rights movement that everyone actually hears about that happened in 1950, of course, with the bus boycotts and the sit-ins. I feel like everyone really knows about that. But the time in between this case and that is the scene where the public libraries really started to develop. And so in that time, we actually get Andrew Carnegie. He is a steel magnate. He was actually really big in the public library movement. He issued grants to a lot of the places that were overlooked and had poor funding. And he was really big into bringing in the Black public library that came to develop. So although he was issuing grants and issuing money to build these, he had no race stipulations. He never explicitly said that this was a white only facility or a Black only facility. It kind of just developed in the South because that of the Plessy case and the separation and the separate but equal being the law, these facilities kind of just developed into being separate places. So of course, there's the white versus the Black libraries. The white libraries typically had better books and services and better buildings. So Black people started to really utilize any type of the building that they could. That is an example there of a Carnegie Library in Atlanta that was established in 1902. Carnegie donated about $45 million to library construction to areas with poor library service, which of course ended up mainly being in southern states, which is why we get the library that we see here in Atlanta. He also gave money to other Black services like community centers as well. So this branch here that was established in 1902 was funded, of course, by Carnegie, but it was also kept up by taxing some of the citizens that lived there. And actually, W.B. Du Bois had a really big speech about the fact that if everyone's paying taxes on these buildings, they should be allowed to also enter them and have access to the same things that everyone else is. So of course, Carnegie is not the only person that's funding libraries in the South. Henry Rosenberg was big down in Texas. He actually established the first colored branch that we get in Galveston, Texas, which is the picture you see here. And that's an example of like a library card that they would have used back then. So it was the first one in the South, allegedly. That was established in 1905. So this is the colored branch. There was actually a main branch that was established in 1904. But of course, that main branch had the same issues with segregation that we're seeing today. So this colored branch was actually kind of developed in the local high school called Central High School. So it wasn't really like a big library. It was more so of just like this little room opening. It opened with about 4,000 different books in it, had about 210 members. And it did close in 1959. It was actually finally integrated into the main branch. So not all places had very like nice buildings like that. A lot of people just kind of had the picture that we see here on the left, which is a like reading room. Typically they would go in places like churches or schools or even sometimes people's homes, wherever they would be more welcome. And they would kind of just establish their own type of reading library service there. So I don't know if you can kind of see there's like some books lined on the wall, kind of like one little table in the middle. And that was kind of the library that they would use in places where of course they didn't have a Carnegie Library or more so like a colored branch to get into. And then of course we get over here on the right is the Sweet Auburn branch in Atlanta, Georgia. That was actually a Carnegie branch as well. So eventually they were kind of upgraded from these reading rooms to get their actual buildings once they were able to secure some of the grants. So even though they were upgrading from the like damp kind of reading rooms and into an actual building, the books and everything that went with it didn't necessarily also improve. More so they were kind of bringing over the limited resources they had there and kind of shuffling it over into the better building. So although it may seem like this is some progress, we're moving up from just a basic room into an actual building, it really wasn't, because even by the year 1932, 89% of Black people still did not have library access. And so this is here actually local to LaGrange. It actually says the LaGrange Negro Library that was established in 1951 with local funding. I was trying to see exactly if that came from being taxed or if there was a grant. Couldn't find the exact numbers on that there. I'm assuming they say local funding. I'm assuming it probably came more from taxes to get this building built. But that was just kind of something interesting I saw for like a local aspect of it. There's also an example here of another library card that is Edward Page Jr. And he was a private first class in the Army during the Korean War. All right, and so of course we had Carnegie and Rosenberg in the library game. We also had Julius Rosenwald. And by 1932, he was well established because he had already been developing schools for Black people. And he actually ended up funding some of the libraries as well. He gave access to over 140,000 Black people to have access to libraries. So of course, now we're leading to public libraries have more funding, more support. There are more people that are actually backing the Black people's access to books and education. So although their own branches were being supported, the nicer locations where they had access to better resources, they were still being discriminated against at the main branch. So of course, after a few years of this inequality that was going on, it kind of led to what we like to call the Southern Library Movement. So the Southern Library Movement was kind of led by Black civic and religious organizations, more educators in the community and clergy people. And so what we have here is a sit-in, or more of like a read-in, because they would just go sit and read, that happened in Alexandria, Virginia in 1939. So who we have here on the right is going to be Samuel Tucker. He was kind of the main mastermind that was behind this operation. Basically, they had an entire plan of they were going to get dressed up in their Sunday's best and they were going to go down to the library and sit and read until they were removed. But they made sure that they would have photographers outside to capture this picture here on the left. So that way this could circulate throughout the media and the Black press so they could see well-dressed young men just trying to read. So in August 21st of 1939, there was a nonviolent protest with about 6 men who did exactly that, got all dressed up and staged these photos here to circulate through the Black press. That really helped because it kind of changed the narrative that books were only for the Black elite or the Black people that had money or anything like that. We were trying to really make education available to all. So this really led to more organization, which allowed for more staged sit-ins or more staged read-ins to help make more formal changes to how the libraries were going. So although this was initially, it may seem like it was about schools or education, it affected everything. And then of course, we get to the Brown versus Board of Education. So this was a really big step here because it led to the desegregation of public schools. But really, if you look into it, it's more so about all public places, which of course bled over into public libraries as well. So even though the Southern governments were, of course, supposed to uphold this new law, they refused to change, and Jim Crow laws were still kind of being followed, even though it really wasn't legal. And so, of course, they were doing the integrations that were happening at the school, but libraries also became a popular place to do demonstrations because they really stood out in the community. Again, those were the buildings that usually had some of the funding, so they're the biggest buildings that you can see in downtown that Black people were being denied access to. So that was usually a pretty good place to start if you wanted some attention. And so what we have here is where we had one of the pretty famous sit-ins. It is in Danville, Virginia. It happened in 1960. And what I find the most interesting about this particular demonstration is that it was organized all by a 17-year-old. His name was Robert Williams. The library movement was kind of led by teenagers and college-age young people because they had a different mindset than their parents or the generations before them, because they were having more access to education and they had that desire for higher learning. And so since these public libraries are developing, they were really eager to get in there and kind of further their education. So he was inspired by some of the protests that were happening at the lunch counters in Greensboro, North Carolina. Public libraries were easy places to go protest, again, because like here, it's one of the biggest buildings that you see. And let's see, this is a pretty significant place to kind of have a demonstration because Danville, Virginia was known as the last Confederate capital. That is where Davis fled after Lee recommended that they leave Richmond. So it's pretty symbolic to what the South has going on. So for there to be a demonstration there to support integrating that library, it was pretty significant. So of course, after all of this demonstration here and the read-in, it was actually fairly successful and actually led to a federal court case that basically said that library segregation is unacceptable. So the case was Giles versus the Library Advisory Committee of Danville, again, happened in 1960. It made segregation in libraries against the law. So again, of course, we've seen with these previous court cases, just because something is against the law does not mean that it's going to be upheld by the masses, which is basically exactly what happened here. They actually did something that was more so unique to libraries called vertical integration, which means that they would allow the Black people in, but they would just remove all of the tables and chairs. And so it was kind of vertical because people would just be there standing in the library, which of course no one's going to go and just stand for hours. So that was more of a way of them saying, kind of appeasing the law and saying like, sure, of course they're welcome here, but there's no tables and there's no chairs. Some other branches would honestly just close just to avoid integrating. Of course, well, like, I guess not of course, but thankfully this Danville branch was peacefully integrated, even with the issues they were having with the things like vertical integration. But of course, that's not the case everywhere. And unfortunately, we get instances like places in Anniston, Alabama. That is a picture there of the Anniston Carnegie Library that is in Anniston, Alabama. So in 1963, Reverends W.B. McLean and Quintus Reynolds were actually brutally attacked for just trying to enter into the library. Reynolds was actually hit with a chain and stabbed twice, and McLean was actually jumped by 10 men. Both of them were chased back to their cars with rocks being thrown at it. Of course, again, their main plan was just to go in, ask for a library card, and just that was going to be their only thing. There just happened to be people outside that saw that and did not really like how that was going. This library was eventually desegregated a few years later, but with police escort because there was such a violent issue the first time. So unfortunately, this issue really didn't garner too much press because unfortunately, it actually happened on the same day as the 16th Street Birmingham church bombing. So of course, I found this newspaper article here where you can kind of see that it's mentioned, but you see what gets the main headline. So it did happen, but of course it did get brushed over because there were so many other horrible things happening, unfortunately, at the same time. All right. So there were numerous disadvantages to the library movement, which kind of made it remarkable of the fact that it actually even was successful in some of these places with police escorts or even just peacefully integrated like the places in Danville. So the movement kind of got its start in the early 40s and 50s. Sit-ins and read-ins really greatly impacted that cause. And since libraries were not compulsory institutions, as in they weren't required by law, they were sometimes just integrated just due to appeasement, which I mean, that's not the best way, but I mean, people were allowed in. And so that's kind of the main goal here. So library movement, it kind of did take a back seat to some of the larger things that were going on. As you could kind of see from what we had with that newspaper article before, there were so many things that were happening that the libraries kind of just got swept under the rug, which I feel like there's some stories that still need to be told out there, but the good thing is that since the libraries weren't a main focus, they were able to be more peacefully integrated than some of the other public places that we would see happening. What really set this apart was that it was mainly the young people that got this done. Like the instance where we saw the 17-year-old that started this, that started his own movement. It was a lot of younger people and college age people that were really the driving force that set out to get this done. And they did so without any type of media coverage that you would see for some of the other protests that were happening. And so by 1965, libraries were no longer the target sites for any demonstrations. Public libraries really set a precedent when it came to sort of sit-ins and read-ins, because there were some efforts that started as early as 1939. It was really remarkable because, again, there were young people with no media outrage that were able to get this kind of integrated all by 1965. And by 1972, 90% of people had library access. So these were kind of the South, like unsung heroes, younger people, college age people that really just wanted the right to read. And they sat out and got that done just by sitting and reading until they were forcefully removed. So thank you. Yes, if there are any questions, I will take them. Yes.
So when there were still segregated libraries, was there ever pressure to control what kind of materials were available in African American libraries to kind of limit what resources and information they would have access to?
I feel like that probably was the case. I'm not sure if I ran across that specifically stated in my research, but if you're looking at the way that they treated some of the public high schools, I would assume they're probably treating some of the public libraries the same way.
Of course, that would have to beg the question of who was in control of the African American libraries. And do you know who would have controlled those libraries?
Not necessarily. As far as it comes for getting the books there, it seemed like it was more of a community effort. It seems like it was more of just they were the ones that were kind of funding the libraries and getting the books in. That is something I could look more into and add on to the research, exactly who was funding the particular books that were coming in. So,
do you have any stories from maybe local libraries about who that were integrated?
So
like Columbus or Grange or Charlton or
So the only one I could find of significance here, like super local, would of course be this LaGrange Negro Library. Let me see if I can see exactly when that one was integrated. I do know that it was started in 1951 and it was shut down by 1959, I believe. So
I found this week, actually. I don't know if I'm audible. Laura Lewis was interviewed as one of our oral history interviews. And she was the first African-American librarian in all of Troup County. It shut down in 1959 when she transferred to the Grange Memorial.
that was relatively early.
Mhm.
And her interview talks about how peaceful it was. Just kind of, she made the transfer from one office to another, and that's the way it happened. It was just the other librarians introduced her to the community.
And then this building, which is still standing, it eventually became the Ethel Kite Library.
Mhm.
And it is closed, I believe. Now,
I believe so, yes.
yes.
Several boys and girls are meeting.
But I do know it was in operation at least until I graduated high school in 95.
Yeah, that kind of peaceful transition, I feel like, was honestly the main thing that happened. There weren't too many instances like the one that we saw in Anniston, Alabama, where there was actual violence. More so it would just be a police escort. So, yeah.
So it would have been one of the first institutions in the community that
Mhm.
was integrated.
Typically that's what happened. Yeah. I feel like because a lot of people knew that they didn't have to go to the library. And so it wasn't kind of like a big point of contention for people to really keep people from going there. So once it was kind of being integrated, I feel like it was more of just appeasement. People kind of just gave up and they're like, well, oh, okay. So as far as the schools, I feel like that's where more of the focus was kind of directed. And libraries, I mean, thankfully kind of just got pushed to the side and were able to be more peacefully integrated. Anything else?
Let's say thank you, Victoria. And we hope, let's see, I don't want to be in the way, I'm sorry. We hope that you'll join us for our next evening with the expert. It will be Lewis Powell. And he will talk with us about Burke Village and the American Indian village that was once under what is now West Point Lake in April. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.